That's me. I'm a photographer. My name is Donald Weber. I'm going to do something a little bit different than when I presented to the students, only because for those who have actually seen the project that I'm working on, I need about 15 years to present it rather than 15 minutes. So I thought I'm going to talk about something different that is a little bit closer to my heart, where my sort of head is at right now. Maybe some of you will recognize Oh, the Places He'll Go. It's a Dr. Seuss book, which every parent in America, it seems, gives their kid on graduation. And I was thinking of this the other day because I don't have a child, but I do have a nephew, and I've spent a heck of a lot of time with him. And I always think about, I wonder where he'll be in the future. And then I was thinking about documentary photography, I guess, is essentially my child. As sad as that sounds, that's where it is right now. And I thought, I'm going to write a letter to documentary photography. And I'm going to say, where are you going to be in the future? Where can you go? Where will you go? And then I was just reading this Dr. Seuss thing last night, and I thought, kid, you'll move mountains. Today is your day. Your mountain is waiting, so get on your way. And that made me sort of think about, now is the time to really begin action and to just go where you want to go. But taking a couple of steps back with documentary photography, photojournalism, whatever it is, I was thinking about today we are in this era. It's the era of the visual world, the image. The television is something that has brought us, much joy in our life, but our lives today, especially today, are much more visual, image-based. And then it also made me think about journalism. There's a huge discussion happening all the time, ad infinitum, every day, every day, every day. It seems we discuss, what can journalism be? And I was just looking back at some past examples of another crisis in journalism, which was happening in the 1950s and 60s. And I think about Truman Capote, Joe Didion, Tom Wolfe, George Plimpton, Norman Mailer. These are all journalists who completely pushed the limits of what journalism could be. So what is propriety of journalism today? Where are our George Plimptons and Norman Mailers? They're out there somewhere, and I hope to find them. Then that made me think of another thing. This is my work. I don't normally like to show my own work in a presentation like this, but I wanted to show this because there's a reason. This is a little series I did from Kiev during Euromaidan. It's a series of Molotov cocktails. It took me about 2 hours to shoot, but I did it and I liked it because it sort of, to me, summed up the story of what was happening at that time in Kiev. But I got a lot of mail and I got a lot of flack from a lot of people saying, what the hell are you doing? You are disturbing and ruining the tradition of what good photojournalism is. And then that made me think of this paper, or this picture. That's me, that's my friend Anastasia, that is Kiev, that is February, that is right in the heart of the event. I'm dirty, I'm tired, I'm not enjoying myself, it was a terrible time to be there. But why is my experience devalued? I was also there. I was also taking pictures. I was also experiencing it. But because I chose not to shoot it in a specific way, I was sort of seen as a cast-off. So that made me think, well, what else has happened out there? Where else can we go with photography? And why is it that we need to sort of only look in one direction? And it's not anything that's new. I don't know how many people here know the photographer Bill Burke, but he's been working for 40 years building collages in text and really sort of pushing the limits of what a photograph is, using old techniques, playing around with light, and as I said before, collages in text. So again, it's not something new. It's not this new invention that has suddenly occurred here. I also thought of Jim Goldberg, Raised by Wolves, which is now probably a 30-year-old book. And Jim is famous for text. He's famous for collages. He's famous for, just taking things and moving and manipulating and sort of trying to find the right voice for the story that he needs to tell. Another instance that I started thinking about is not necessarily this project per se by Bromberg and Chanarin, but this picture specifically sort of moves me because it's not a photograph. It's not a picture, it's not even an image, but what it is data. Soon, cameras will not be in existence. We have ones and zeros. But when we, as humans, look at this, we think that it's a picture. But if cameras are not going to be taking photographs anymore, then what the hell is going to happen to documentary photography? which to me is a very, very interesting proposition. So soon we're going to have to sort of transition from this idea that we only take things with cameras and have to start looking elsewhere. So if ones and zeros can now create images, what else is there out there? How else are other people looking at pictures? What is going to happen to even the meaning of an image? And so I thought I would also do a little bit of self-promotion because I teach at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague, and I thought I'm going to show a couple of recent graduates. Just because to me I think it's interesting to show what they're up to. How are they thinking? How do they see documentary and photojournalism today? It's very different than the world that Amy and Jonathan and I have grown up with. Very different. And I was curious to see how do they interpret their own world and where is it going to be going? In other words, I'm trying to give them my Dr. Seuss book and say, oh, the places you'll go. But again, it's up to them to sort of determine. So I'm just going to show a bunch of projects that I found kind of interesting. Some are my students, some are not, some are other projects that are really kind of pushing and expanding the limits of what it means to even make an image that has some kind of documentary practice behind it. So I'm sure for the Dutch audience, we might know of this project by Esther Hofers, who graduated last year. But this is basically using composition, photo manipulation or composition to create a singular image. She was interested in how surveillance cameras can track and dictate who we are and what our movements are, and when those movements become threatening. So how she created this image is basically stitched together and then using multiple frames to create basically one tableau. So condensing time and making one image. But again, using Photoshop to sort of make these collages of these multiple people making, I guess, threatening gestures for surveillance that would then get picked up. Another student who graduated just last year as well, Anak Levin. You can find me anywhere. A completely different project, but I think one is great because it's actually sort of a critique on the way the media actually corroborates and uses sources in terms of investigating a certain story. So she found this guy named Greg Packer, there he is, who has basically been quoted in over 150 news articles in New York. Whenever something happens, the media calls up Greg Packer and says, hey Greg, tell me something, what's happening? Oh, well, I have something to say, blah, 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 blah. But then the project became a lot more collaborative, and here's a couple of frames of Greg, and it became a discussion between Greg and the photographer, and she allowed the photographer or the subject to choose her own images. So green are the ones he liked, red are the ones he didn't, yellow the ones he was sort of indifferent by. And then there became, it's not presented here, but there's sort of a whole collaborative dialogue between the subject and the photographer. So suddenly, she's actually acknowledging that the subject is just as important as the photographer. It's an equal relationship, which mostly I find in photography it's not. Usually the power balance is in the hands of the photographer. So this is a photographer who said, why don't you dictate the terms? But also using this man who was being quoted forever in newspapers in New York to sort of say, well, what is the relevance of media even today? Another student just graduated a couple of months ago, houndspool. Hopefully I pronounced that right, probably not. Another very strange project, but he was sort of interested in images and how we as citizens can be manipulated by images in the political process. So I'll just show a few of the installations that he used. And the other reason I kind of wanted to show this was because it's not really for a magazine. It's not even for an exhibition. It's not for a shipping container. It's just this kind of thing that can go in a million different ways. Who cares how it goes? Maybe it's only a ballot, or maybe it is some kind of poster, or maybe it is some kind of installation. So basically what he did is you can sort of see here, he found Putin with a dog. He made a giant ballot. This is David Cameron with another dog. I guess dogs are very popular. Angela Merkel with a young girl. And he allowed people to basically vote who is the cutest politician. But again, looking at the idea of propaganda, looking at the idea of information, and allowing, again, the audience to sort of engage and determine their own sort of story or version of this. Another student, also just graduated, Samuel Otte, project called Duvall. This is sort of a fascinating project because it's not necessarily saying anything new. As you can see, Jim Goldberg or Bill Burke have been working in this tradition for a long, long, long time. But what I like about it is its complete subjectivity of his own experience. This is a project, he's Dutch, he's from the Bible Belt somewhere. I'm not specifically sure where he's from, and he's from a very Orthodox Protestant evangelical family. And the project is essentially split between the past generations, his grandfather, his father. Amanda's looking at me with smart acknowledgement. You should check this project out. But it's split between the past and where the generation, his generation, wants to go in the schism that is created. And I remember seeing this project while he was working on it. He was trying it in very, very many different ways, and it wasn't quite working. And finally, he sort of figured out, I have to tell this story as if I'm writing a letter, like I was writing a letter to documentary. He's writing a letter to his family to sort of say, this is who I am and this is where I want to go. I also thought it was kind of a nice, apt metaphor for exactly the experience that we are in right now. Our grandparents and our parents see one perspective. It's now up to our children to sort of say, yeah, but you know what? This is where I want to go. And now not some students, but just some other projects that I find really fascinating and also kind of using different means, different perspectives to really sort of find something. This is a German photographer. I find this portrait absolutely fascinating, but it's completely staged, obviously. I don't know how many women wear an alligator skin thing with their twin babies, but the story behind this is she was trying to take a perfect picture, and she was constantly setting up every day, every day, every day, every day, until she finally got the picture that she felt was the picture that best represents what it is that she wanted to say. So waiting and waiting and waiting, but also constructing a scene and constructing a space where potentially something can happen. This is a German photographer as well, Michael Vesely, a project called Open Shutter. I don't know if anybody knows this whole series, but basically he takes one frame from a series of weeks to it can be years. This is a 6-month time frame, I guess you could say, of, I forget the name of the plaza, but this is the Humboldt University. And it's a 6-month frame, but what is interesting about this is the idea of compression of time. That photography is pretty much about the space of time, but for us, once the image is made, it's in the past. And what I like about here is that it's completely sort of turning that notion on its head and looking at a photograph as something of the future. And sort of how can we address time in a photographic way? But again, it's multiple exposures, it's one frame, and that's it. So again, the image is completely manipulated. Swedish guy, A Minor Wrongdoing. I find this project quite fascinating as well. He lives in Hamburg. And at the time he started photographing this project, there was an ordinance by the Hamburg City Council basically outlawing prostitution within, I think, St. Georg or something like that. And this is the activity happening outside his window. And again, it's sort of putting you, the audience, in the place by manipulating the type of image to say, what are these people doing? What kind of behavior are they up to? He's not necessarily saying that this is a prostitute and this is a John, but he's using that language of surveillance, or he's using that language of documentary truth and sort of allowing you to impose your own judgment upon it, which I find another interesting question. Another photographer, Susan Meiselas, who I'm sure we all know of, a project called Reframing History. She's probably most famous for her work in Central America during the early mid-'80s. And I guess about 30 or maybe 40, no, not quite 40 years, but 30 or so years later, she came back and she created these murals of her old photographs, and she went to the place where some of her more well-known photographs were taken and just decided to install it and just sort of see what happens. It's not so dissimilar to what is happening behind the wall here with Disturb. But again, it's not necessarily a photographic medium, but it is something that represents some kind of event or historical truth or something, but allowing the photographer a different way to sort of investigate and to see what happens. Another project, I think it's one of my favorite ones, is a Bosnian artist, Ibro Hasanovic, Study for an Applause, which is basically 9 frames, which is taken from a very famous photograph during the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords. And he is illustrating the applause of the 9 leaders who signed the Dayton Peace Accord. So you've got Clinton and Chirac and I don't know, the EU head at the time, et cetera, and sort of, again, looking at, well, what can a historical truth be? So this AP photograph, which these hand studies are based on, was of a very specific moment in time. But what happens when that time is sort of dissolved? And what is the moment that we can sort of look at in history, and how can we represent that? And he felt it was represented through this gesture of the hands, of the applause, and that is the moment when history is sort of determined and decided. But again, I like his sort of conceptual look and really understanding what that photograph was about. It wasn't about the pomp and ceremony, it was about this very simple gesture of an applause that basically nullified a 3-year war that killed thousands of people for nothing, essentially. Another photographer uses staging, which is a very controversial topic in our world. But this is the photographer on your right, and this is his father. And the grandfather was killed in World War II in the Soviet Union. And so the father and son decided to try and find out where the grandfather was killed. And in doing their travels, the photographer realized it was much more about this relationship between them and this lost absence of history. But in order to do that, he really wanted to sort of somehow create these tableaus or these scenes of this connection between the father and son. And the best way he felt he could do that is to sort of set up scenes. Now, it's not necessarily what you could say super staging, but saying, okay, Dad, we're going to have lunch. Now let's sort of frame this as something that represents, our quest, not just for the relationship with our grandfather, but our quest for our relationship together. Almost done. This one I find absolutely fascinating. I have to thank Laura for tipping me on this one. This is an Iranian photographer who is essentially staging significant crimes and murders in Iran. This is before the advent of the camera phone, before the advent of really any kind of captive technology. So what happens when something has happened? Perhaps we can look at it in a different light. So again, for me, it's about using a fictional device, but capturing some kind of historical authenticity in the restaging of events. And very well, beautifully done. I highly recommend everybody to check it out. A couple more to go. Lastly, I was also thinking, it's not necessarily always about crazy conceptual devices that you use. In fact, I'm sort of offended when anybody sort of imposes a style upon anything. My philosophy, my belief is a story finds its own voice. It needs to tell you what to do. You don't say, oh, I'm going to do this, and then it's going to turn out like that. That doesn't work. For me, if you know what your story is about, the story then will communicate to you its appropriate visual voice. If it says I need to be staged, then stage it. If it says I need to be done in a classic reportage black and white style, then go do it. I don't think it should matter which choice we make, as long as you make a smart, responsible, intelligent choice. This is a project which is all about collaboration by Swedish photographer Kent Klitsch, working with this, I forget her name, I can't remember off the top of my head, but working with this woman in joint capacity and allowing her to photograph and also allowing her to sort of determine her voice in the story. Again, it's about sort of shifting the power balance between the photographer and the subject. There was also a DVD that accompanies the book, which was completely directed by the subject herself, with Kent's complete no access within that film. I think there's one or two left. This one is definitely, I think, pushing the limits of what a good documentary can be. This is a collective called Collaboration Project, and it's called Memories. And basically, they devised their own card game. And the card game is about how vegetation is taking over a famous partisan World War II monument in Yugoslavia. I'm not quite sure on the rules of the game, but essentially it's a story about vegetation and how this vegetation is sort of consuming our own history and such. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to go in a book or even a transmedia project or anything. It's about finding an appropriate, I think, vehicle that can tell your story. And they felt the best way to respond to this was as a card game. And then lastly, we don't even have pictures. This is a Serbian artist who researches archives of European newspapers during the Yugoslav War, and he finds front pages that sort of talk about some kind of significant news event of that time, and then completely renders them in hand-drawn pen and ink. So these are total reproductions of newspapers that aren't even using the camera. And this is, in a traditional sense, it's pen and ink. I mean, this has been around for centuries. But it also, I think, is starting to ask us now, as I said before with that picture from Bromberg-Chanaran, if there are no photographs anymore, then what can we use to tell a documentary story? Just because a camera is the tool that we have used, there need to be other tools. And that, to me, I think is an exciting proposition, and why we've all been saying this as the masters during the Joop Swart Masterclass. It's now up to you guys, this generation, to say, this is the way we're going to go, and this is how we feel it can be told. Of course, there can be rules, and there can be boundaries, and there can be limits, but I would hope, like Star Trek, we go beyond. So, thank you.